LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup, a slightly delayed version on Monday morning. Thanks for joining me. I picked out about 30 of the weekend's best clips for what should be a really interesting show this morning. As usual, my clips come mostly from those Sunday morning news analysis shows on the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. And I'll also have the usual political comedy clips from Friday night's Real Time with Bill Maher. You can see the topics I'm going to cover listed down in the video description. If you're watching this as a recorded show, you should see time and indexes down there to skip to the topics that interest you the most. Tonight's topics include this media furor over Rudy Giuliani saying President Obama doesn't love America, the threat against Mall of America in Minnesota from the African Islamist group Al-Shabaab, the President's Summit on Combating Violent Extremism that was in Washington, D.C. this last week, the continuing threat from the Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call it, this split in the Republican Party, both on the issue of whether to fund Homeland Security and then going into the 2016 presidential election. This federal judge finding that immigration, the President Obama's executive action on immigration was unconstitutional and the fallout from that. And one quick clip on Ukraine at the end. But before I get to that, I got a couple questions from viewers in the last couple weeks about why my LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup wasn't monetized, and I had some questions about that too. They just like inexplicably the videos haven't been monetized, and I finally got a response from YouTube Help. This is what they told me. Due to the sensitive nature of the content in your video, we've decided that it's not appropriate for advertising at this time. So it's because there's something too sensitive about what I've been talking about the last couple weeks that they've decided not to let me monetize the video as a partner, so I can't get paid for the 10 or more than 10 hours of work I do on the show. Of course, I had a couple quick questions that I immediately responded to ask. First, is there any way to appeal the decision? Because it doesn't make sense. Because I'm just using clips from the commercial news networks and they already get advertising. And then also, I wanted more guidance as to what it is I'm saying that's too sensitive so that I can try to avoid that in the future possibly. And of course, the answer I got from YouTube Help was not very illuminating. First, they said they can't give me any more details or guidance on what it is, and there's no appeal. So it's basically up to me to guess what's too sensitive for me to monetize my videos as a partner. And basically, I'm not going to change the clips that I pick. Based on a few videos that have not been monetized over the last couple months, I think it might be Muslims. I'm not supposed to talk about Muslims and Islam. But that, like you saw from the email I got, I can't know that for sure. But I'm just going to pick out what I think are the best clips, and I'm going to choose the topics that I think are most important that are in the corporate media. And if YouTube doesn't want to monetize it, all I can ask is, if you'll see a link down there to support my video making on Patreon, if I get that up to like maybe $400 a month so that I'm getting paid like $100 a Sunday for the 4 Sundays I do a month, 10 plus hours, I think that would make it so that I don't have to worry about whether YouTube monetizes the videos or whether they think it's too sensitive. So please consider supporting my videos on Patreon so I don't have to worry about the advertising revenue from YouTube to make this, at least somewhat cost effective to spend my time on every Sunday. Anyway, having covered those questions that a couple people asked me about what's going on with the monetization of my videos, I want to get to the first topic for tonight, or not tonight, this morning from yesterday. I'm so used to doing a nightly show. But this topic is kind of a strange one. Rudy Giuliani was at some fundraiser for Republican Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, who's probably running for president, and he said that he didn't think that President Obama loved America, and that created this media firestorm. First, I'm going to show how Bill Maher treated that on his in his monologue last Friday, making kind of a big joke about it over in this clip.
Heard about that. That's a firestorm. You heard what Rudy Giuliani said? Oh my gosh. He said, I don't believe the president, meaning Obama, He does concede that. He said, I don't believe the president loves America. Wow. See, nobody loves America like Rudy Giuliani. He's got a blind, burning, star-spangled boner for this country. He leaves notes on America's car. He calls America's voicemail just to hear its voice. If America were a woman, he'd move her into the mayor's mansion while he was still married to his wife. He loves America. It's very personal. The full quote actually is, I do not believe the president loves America. He doesn't love you, and he doesn't love me. Oh, poor Rudy. He's got fame, he's got money, but what he's never had is the love of a strong black man. And
So I thought Bill Maher kind of made fun of Rudy Giuliani for his comments there in a way that Rudy Giuliani deserved to be made fun of. But it wasn't just Rudy Giuliani who looked bad from this whole episode. It was also the media itself, I think. And I was really pleased to see Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press yesterday make that point really strongly, talking about both what Rudy Giuliani said, but also talking about why it is anyone cares and why is the media even covering this? And I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip from yesterday over here.
And now into this controversy jumps former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who insisted again and again this week that he believes Mr. Obama doesn't love his country. Should Giuliani's opinion even matter, though? Is it relevant or constructive? Those questions, of course, weren't dealt with. Instead, we got the inevitable media feeding frenzy that was wholly unsatisfactory and likely met with more than a few eye rolls.
Breaking tonight, new outrage and backlash.
Is Rudy Giuliani adding insult to injury?
I just can't believe it came out of his mouth.
It's cable catnip, and eventually network and front page catnip, too. Exhibit A of what happens when a former official, desperate to stay relevant, is given a megaphone. Television turns up the volume, and politicians, afraid of their own base, refuse to take it away.
Rudy Giuliani.
This week's Race to the Bottom, led by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, is proving why Americans are learning to hate politics and the media. On Wednesday, Giuliani told a group of donors at a fundraiser for Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, I do not believe, and I know this is a horrible thing to say, but I do not believe that the president loves America. He wasn't brought up the way you were brought up, and I was brought up through love of this country. Over the next 48 hours, Giuliani attempted to explain himself and either doubled down or dug deeper, depending upon your point of view.
Mr. Mayor, do you want to apologize for your comment?
Not at all. I want to repeat it. The reality is, from all that I can see of this president, all that I've heard of him, he apologizes for America. He criticizes America.
Giuliani defended his comments to the New York Times, saying, quote, some people thought it was racist. I thought that was a joke, since he was brought up by a white mother, a white grandfather, went to white schools, and most of this he learned from white people. This isn't racism. This is socialism, or possibly anti-colonialism. Giuliani even used an old racial dog whistle of the civil rights era, communism.
His grandfather introduced him to Frank Marshall Davis, who was a communist.
Democrats seem to enjoy watching the spectacle unfold. The White House introduced the hashtag Obama Loves America on Thursday.
It's sad to see when somebody who's attained a certain level of public stature and even admiration tarnishes that legacy so thoroughly.
Florida Senator Marco Rubio demonstrated that it is possible to criticize the president, but stay rational.
Democrats aren't asked to answer every time Joe Biden says something embarrassing. So I don't know why I should answer every time a Republican does. I'll suffice it to say that I believe the president loves America. I just think his ideas are bad.
But given the opportunity to take the high road, other Republicans whiffed.
Well, I think the president and the mayor can speak for themselves. I know America, and I know there's people all across the political spectrum from Republican to Democrat who certainly do. But that's something that the mayor and the president have to talk about.
And Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal put out a statement saying, quote, if you are looking for someone to condemn the mayor, look elsewhere.
I think that last part's kind of funny, where Governor Bobby Jindal is like inserting himself into the controversy before anyone even asked him, because he's trying to be relevant in the presidential campaign. And it is kind of sad that this is where presidential campaigns, where the dialogue is, and these sort of like you have former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, trying to get media attention by saying something provocative, and then all the Republican nominees have to inject themselves into the controversy, even though it's kind of a stupid controversy. And even more stupid than the patriotism comment was what he said about Obama's viewpoint coming from socialism or anti-colonialism. The anti-colonialism charge, I mean, is that something that are there like pro-colonialists or people who admit to being pro-colonialist? I don't know. And that's something that Bill Maher discussed with his panel. This includes some comments from Rob Reiner and Fran Lebowitz back from Friday's show over in this clip.
The other thing Giuliani said is that it wasn't racism. He said it's socialism or possibly anti-colonialism.
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah.
First of
We're
all,
the colony. We're the colony.
Yes.
We're against ourselves.
You can count the stars.
Isn't colonialism bad? I thought we were all kind of on that page.
Yeah.
And now it's bad to be anti-colonial?
Yes.
I don't understand that. But you're right. What was George Washington fighting against?
They're not talking about that colonialism.
What are they talking about?
They're talking about the anti-colonialism of like Africans, Indians, against
Rhodesia.
the British. That anti-colonialism.
And that's bad?
To them. I'm explaining them to you, not me to you.
But it was the British with us.
I'm not in the Republican primary.
I know.
Okay?
I understand. But
It was the British with us. We were the colonies to the British.
He's not thinking back quite that far.
Okay.
He's stuck in the 50s.
It's just, yeah.
But how did,
So, you can see they kind of made fun of the whole anti-colonialism thing. I mean, wasn't George Washington anti-colonialist? But as Fran Lebowitz pointed out, for Republicans, anti-colonialism means supporting the communist uprisings in Africa and Latin America. Even though we're supposed to be anti-colonialist, we sort of forgot to be anti-colonialist from the 50s onward when it came to those kinds of things. But I also want to show a response from Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson. He did the full Ginsburg. He was on all 5 of the Sunday morning shows yesterday morning. And I'm just going to show, I'm trying not to be too duplicative in showing the same answers he gave on different shows, but a couple times he was asked about what Rudy Giuliani said, because he was actually appointed a U.S. attorney or somehow was hired by Rudy Giuliani many years ago. And you can see he actually says some positive things about Rudy Giuliani, but then says that, of course, what he said was not helpful and was unfortunate over in this clip.
I want to ask you about something else. You used to work with Rudy Giuliani. He said last week that he thought the president did not love America. What's your response to that?
You're correct. Rudy hired me to be a federal prosecutor 26 years ago. This past 9/11, Mayor Giuliani and I spent together in New York City touring fire stations, police precincts. So I know him well, and I respect Mayor Giuliani a lot for the leadership and the visibility he had right after 9/11. It's an example for how those of us in government should respond to a crisis. I think his latest comments are not helpful and are unfortunate. His comments about the President of the United States, I think they're unfortunate.
So that's a good way to really stick it to Rudy Giuliani, is to say some nice things about him first and then say unhelpful and unfortunate. And then the last clip I want to show on this whole media kerfuffle over the Rudy Giuliani comments about President Obama not being patriotic or not loving his country. This is from a California Republican member of Congress, Darrell Issa, who he seems to be most focused on where you should take this if you're a Republican. He totally pivots around or pivots the whole issue around from the unfortunate, unhelpful things that Rudy Giuliani said to what we should be thankful that he really brought up, even though he didn't really bring it up over in this clip.
Colleagues are saying.
Let me let Congressman Issa get his 2 cents in here. Do you have any defense for what the mayor said? Well, I don't think Rudy's ever going to get the dust from ground zero out of his lungs. He was there during the fall of those towers. So for him to take personally a president whose policies have left Israel hanging, have left our Arab allies not trusting us, have let ISIL, as the governor said, go from being called a JV team as they took on more territory expansively from Algeria to Iraq than, in fact, the size of Texas. So the reality is that Rudy has taken our debate, and I think we should thank him for this part of it, back to national security, to the key element that the president should be focusing on. He needs to call it Islamic terrorism. He can't be looking at everything through the vision that somehow if you treat people better, if we're more democratic, you're not going to have terrorism, and then have his own secretary telling people they have to be vigilant if they go to a mall in Minnesota. The reality is that we are losing the war against Islamic fundamentalists around the world, and it is not about religion, he says, but it is about religion. These people hate us for who we are and who we're not. And if we don't get on board with allies we can find and root out these terrorist organizations, then America will not be safe. They're saying it on this Sunday, and yet at the same time, we have a haphazard, no boots on the ground effort around the globe. And that's just not right.
Let me take...
So, yeah, I think Congressman Darrell Issa there pretty much fit all the good Republican talking points about hating President Obama's foreign policy in there. Of course, his first answer was, when asked, shouldn't we be ashamed or shouldn't we ask for his 2 cents on Rudy Giuliani's hateful comments there. His first answer was, of course, 9/11. He has the dust of 9/11 in his lungs, so we can't really criticize him knowing that. And then the whole foreign policy thing, and he even talked about the Mall of America threat. And so that's the next set of clips I want to show you. Is just a few quick clips on this latest threat of terrorism in the United States, supposedly, at least that got media exposure. This is from the group Al-Shabaab, that we haven't heard from in a while. They did this Kenyan mall attack, so since their signature attack, I guess, is against malls, they put out this video saying that they're going to attack malls in the United States, Canada, and UK, and they specifically mentioned the Mall of America in Minnesota, and Minnesota has a high Somali Muslim population, and so this threat has really been played up over the weekend and on all the shows, even though it turns out there's not really any specific credible threat. All they did was make a video. I mean, I'm making a video right now, so I don't know exactly how threatening it is just to make a video. But first, here's how ABC covered the threat with their senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, over in this clip.
George, those new terror threats come in a propaganda video recently released by the Al-Qaeda-linked Somali group Al-Shabaab. The video appears to call for attacks on Western malls, including in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. Minnesota's Mall of America was specifically mentioned by name. This is the same terror group that claimed responsibility for a deadly attack on the Kenyan Mall 2 years ago. 67 people were killed in that 4-day siege on a Nairobi shopping center. This new threat has the attention of U.S. officials because Al-Shabaab has been able to successfully recruit dozens of young men from the Minneapolis area. FBI and Homeland Security officials tell me they are aware of the video. The Mall of America has been contacted. Mall officials put out a statement saying they have implemented new security precautions. Some of the measures will be noticeable, others won't be. George, all malls throughout the country will be made aware of this threat, and federal officials tell me that they've been working with malls and shopping centers for some time on just this kind of threat. George?
So that's the ABC report on this, and like I said, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson was on all 5 of the Sunday morning shows yesterday morning, and he was asked about this threat on all of them. He pretty much used the same talking points on all of them. He said people should be vigilant. He said, and he used this, he kept saying this is a new phase where in the war on terrorism, basically that there could be lone wolves and that we have to worry about this more diffuse threat. But on one of the shows over on CNN State of the Union, he actually said that people, when asked if people should go to the malls, said that people should be particularly careful, and sort of made the threat seem a little more real that way. And That was probably the farthest he went in terms of saying there was a serious threat when Gloria Borger on CNN State of the Union asked him how serious the threat was over in this clip.
George, those new terror threats come in a propaganda video.
Seriously, are you taking this threat?
I am very concerned about the serious potential threat of independent actors here in the United States. We've seen this now in Europe. We've seen this in Canada.
But specifically against the Mall of America?
Anytime a terrorist organization calls for an attack on a specific place, we've got to take that seriously. And so through our intelligence bulletins, through working with state and local law enforcement, through working with the FBI, we take this kind of thing very seriously.
And I just want to read you one more thing on this. This is a statement from the Mall of America today. Mall of America is aware of a threatening video that was released, which included a mention and images of the mall. We take any potential threat seriously and respond appropriately. We have implemented extra security precautions. Some may be noticeable to guests and others won't. What are you telling Americans who might be planning a trip to the mall this Sunday?
What we're telling the public in general is you've got to be vigilant. We just revamped our If You See Something, Say Something campaign at the Super Bowl last month. And so public engagement, public awareness is critical. Americans should still feel that they are free to associate. They are free to go to public gatherings. But it's critical that we have public awareness and public participation in our efforts.
Are they safe in going to the Mall of America today? If you want to go take your kids to the Mall of America?
I would say that if anyone is planning to go to the Mall of America today, they've got to be particularly careful. And as the statement you read indicates, there will be enhanced security there that will be apparent to people who go there.
Federal security as well?
There will be enhanced security there. But public vigilance, public awareness, and public caution in situations like this is particularly important. And it's the environment we're in, frankly. And it's all the more reason why I need a budget, and I'm assuming you're going to ask me about that.
I will.
I'll get to that budget question in a few minutes, but I want to show the follow-up that Chuck Todd had on Meet the Press to that answer that Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson gave to Gloria Borger on CNN State of the Union. You notice how he said, when asked if people should actually still go to the Mall of America, he said they should be particularly careful. Like I said before I showed the clip, that was the farthest he went in terms of hyping the threat, I guess. And Chuck Todd, who, Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, I think he's like winning the Sunday morning shows most weeks. I already showed how he covered the Rudy Giuliani media kerfuffle as a problem more with the media than with Rudy Giuliani or anyone else. And here you can see he actually watched what Jay Johnson said on CNN State of the Union and got a follow-up question for him over in the last clip I'll show on the Mall of America threat, such that it is over here.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
Let me start with this threat by Al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda offshoot from Somalia, targeting, we talked about it earlier, targeting malls, potentially in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. In particular, though, Mall of America in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, large Somali population there, so obviously I assume a concern that you could have lone wolves. In an earlier interview this morning, you said the following: if anyone is planning to go to the Mall of America today, they've got to be particularly careful. It sounds like you're taking that, you believe this threat is that serious? You would basically tell people, you're almost telling them, I hear that, I would not go to the mall.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the public needs to be particularly vigilant. Chuck, we're in a new phase in the global terrorist threat right now, which involves core Al-Qaeda, but now other groups, the ISIL group being the most prominent example of that, with very effective use of video, publications, social media, and the internet that have the ability to reach into communities, reach into homelands, and inspire independent actors to commit acts of violence, which is why we need a military approach, and we've got one. We're through an international coalition embarking on airstrikes and other things militarily, but also a whole of government approach, a Homeland Security law enforcement approach, which includes countering violent extremism engagements and initiatives here in the homeland. That was one of the things that the summit this week at the White House was all about.
Well, I'm going to get to the summit.
And I'm also going to get to the summit. The summit that was in Washington, D.C. to combat violent extremism, or countering violent extremism, I guess. That is the next topic I'm going to show, and I have several clips on that. And one of the big controversies, especially on Fox News, if you watch Fox News during the week, was, again, whether President Obama is willing to call the violent extremists radical Muslims or radical Islam, and that was a topic that came up a lot on the shows that, and I'm going to show a few clips of that. But first, I want to show again Chuck Todd over on NBC's Meet the Press had sort of a meta-analysis of this, showing how it's kind of a stupid controversy if you compare what President Obama's been saying with what President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney said in the last administration. It's pretty much the same thing for, diplomatic, because we have these Muslim allies, so we don't want to refer to our enemy as Muslim. We want to come up with other words for it. That makes some diplomatic sense, even though I personally don't have any problem with calling Muslim extremists Muslim. But here you can see Chuck Todd again kind of winning the Sunday morning shows by making this comparison with videotape or video recordings to the Bush administration over in this clip.
Raged ever since ISIS shocked the world with its cult of violence and death. What should President Obama call this enemy? He has refused to use the terms Islamist or radical Islam, insisting that we are not at war with Islam, but with some perversion of a great religion. Conservatives argue that in doing so, Mr. Obama is failing to recognize the true face of the enemy. So we wondered in this debate about semantics and security, is there precedent for the president's position? Well, we went back to the videotape, and here's what we found.
The terrorists do not speak for over 1 billion Muslims who reject their hateful ideology.
All Americans must recognize that the face of terror is not the true face of Islam.
We are not at war with Islam. We are at war with people who have perverted Islam.
This is by no means a war against Islam.
I think all of us recognize that this great religion, in the hands of a few extremists, has been distorted to justify violence towards innocent people that is never justified.
The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace.
So, in fact, President Obama doesn't sound very different from President Bush or Vice President Cheney.
That's an awesome point from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press, and the great clip compilation showing that presidential administrations are basically not going to create this war against Islam or call our enemies Muslims or Islamists, and because we have to have the most peaceful Muslims have to be our allies in the struggle, however the struggle is going to take place. And Chuck Todd also asked the question in a good way to point this out, I think, when he asked Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson about why the president doesn't call it radical Islam. He actually said, would calling it radical Islam make it harder to get cooperation? And you'll see Jay Johnson, Secretary Jay Johnson says that basically that's what Muslims tell him over in this clip.
The whole point of this extremist summit was about, because there is concern. You have these communities, the Twin Cities, the Somali community with a large Muslim population, Dearborn, other communities in the U.S. Is it harder for you to get cooperation in these communities? Do you believe it's harder for you to get this cooperation if the president were out there calling it radical Islam, referring to ISIS, and you having Islamist extremists using that phraseology? Does that actually make it harder for you to do your job or not?
Good question. I've done a number of these engagements myself in Minneapolis, Boston, LA, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago. When I meet with Muslim community leaders, they all pretty much tell me the same thing, which is that ISIL is attempting to hijack my religion. Islam is about peace, and ISIL is attempting to hijack our religion, what we're about. And so to me, to call it Islamic extremism dignifies ISIL and gives them space in the Islamic religion that they don't deserve, and I don't believe Muslim leaders think they deserve. And so ISIL is a very dangerous terrorist organization that represents a serious potential threat to our homeland. We've got to respond militarily. We've got to respond through law enforcement. Frankly, I'm more concerned about how we respond in our counterterrorism efforts than which two words we call it.
Let me move to...
So, like I said, I think that's a pretty reasonable response from Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson to a fairly reasonable question from NBC's Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, where he sort of understands the basic premise that even though there's no reason we shouldn't refer to Muslim extremists as Muslims, there is a good reason why the U.S. government has to be careful about what words it uses because of the alliances it's trying to build to fight the Muslim extremists with the other Muslims who aren't extremists. And having shown how on NBC's Meet the Press they treated this in a more reasonable way, I want to show also how they treated it over on Fox News Sunday. It wasn't the regular host was replaced by John Roberts, who was the guest hosting, and he actually started the show. I mean, I'm sure as the host he doesn't necessarily choose what the intro script is going to be, but the producers or whatever decided that the top story to cover on Fox News Sunday yesterday morning was the fact that President Obama won't call radical Islam, and I'll show just that short intro clip over here.
I'm John Roberts in for Chris Wallace. President Obama hosts a summit on violent extremism, but refuses to use terms like radical Islam to define the enemy.
The notion that the West is at war with Islam is an ugly lie.
You cannot defeat an enemy if you refuse to acknowledge what it is.
So I guess on Fox News Sunday, Senator Ted Cruz is the voice of reason, apparently, because he's willing to call Muslims Muslim, even though, as Chuck Todd showed over on Meet the Press, Obama's doing the same thing that Bush did for diplomatic reasons. And I showed how Chuck Todd asked Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson a reasonable question. Here is sort of the unreasonable way to ask that same question as they did over on Fox News Sunday. John Roberts asking, why won't President Obama call it what it is over in this clip.
The whole point of this extremist summit was about, because there is concern.
Let's talk about terrorism, ISIS, ISIL, your acronym for it, and the president's approach to this. He has been criticized from a number of different fronts for not calling this a battle against Islamic extremism. Why won't he acknowledge that we are fighting Islamic extremism?
Well, first of all, from my perspective, whether it's referred to as Islamic extremism or violent extremism, what it comes down to is ISIL is a terrorist organization that represents a serious potential threat to our homeland, which has to be addressed militarily and through a whole-of-government approach, which is why Homeland Security these days is so important. Law enforcement here in this country, our countering violent extremism efforts in this country. We had a summit about that this week. So it is a dangerous terrorist organization that has to be dealt with.
But
from my perspective.
Is this not a religious ideology?
Well, let me say this. In our engagements around the country, I do a lot of these myself in Muslim communities, Islamic cultural centers, in places like Minneapolis, Boston, LA, Chicago, Columbus, Ohio. The thing I hear from leaders in the Muslim community in this country is ISIL is attempting to hijack my religion. Our religion is about peace and brotherhood, and ISIL is attempting to hijack that from us, and they resent that. Most victims of ISIL are in fact Muslim. So it seems to me that to refer to ISIL as occupying any part of the Islamic theology is playing on a battlefield that they would like us to be on. I think that to call them some form of Islam gives the group more dignity than it deserves, frankly.
So I guess that answer was a little bit duplicative of the previous answer that I showed from Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson, but I wanted to show the difference in the question. And he did add a few other points in there. I think for the first time he mentioned that most of the victims of this kind of Islamic terrorism are actually Muslims. He didn't mention that previously, I don't think, but there were several points that he made again. And I want to show another question that I thought was a little bit biased over on Fox News Sunday from the guest host, John Roberts, where he's still bringing up this whole prayer breakfast thing about President Obama comparing radical Islam in the 21st century to what Christians did in the Crusades. They don't bring up the whole thing about slavery and the other nasty things that have been justified by Christianity in more recent times, but they keep bringing up the Crusades thing and the whole outrage about moral equivalence. And you can see John Roberts asked Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson about that, and I don't think he was expecting that question. He thought they would have given that up by now, because he basically gives kind of a muddled answer going back to sort of the same thing he said about not calling it radical Islam, which doesn't even make sense as an answer, but you can see that over in this clip.
The president has, on occasion, Mr. Secretary, seemed to draw a moral equivalence between what ISIS is doing in the 21st century and what Christians did 1,000 years ago when they were fighting Muslim armies. What's the relevance of making that comparison?
Well, look, again, from my Homeland Security perspective, we've got to deal with this terrorist organization, which is the most prominent on the world stage right now, which is one of the reasons, frankly, why the Department of Homeland Security needs a budget by the end of this week. I hope you're going to ask me about that.
We'll talk about that.
But it is a terrorist organization that is very dangerous. It's on the march, it's on the move, and it is very effective in its use of the internet for recruitment purposes. Again, to say that they are in any form Islamic, I believe, cedes to them a playing field that they would like us to be drawn onto.
At the summit.
So again, like I said, that's sort of a duplication of previous answers, but I thought the question was kind of biased. I don't know why Fox News Sunday is still talking about that prayer breakfast thing, and as I showed the week after the prayer breakfast, when I showed a like 2.5 minute clip of what President Obama actually said, it wasn't even what they're making it out to be, so I'm not sure what that's all about, but I did want to show a clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos where they kind of back up what Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson said in previous clips about how he doesn't want to call it radical Islam because Muslims tell him that makes it harder for them to fight the radical Islam or whatever you want to call it. And Martha Raddatz over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos actually went and talked to this Imam in Minneapolis. Let me make sure I get it. Oh, it's Mohamed Magid, I think is his name. And he talks about both how he has talked teens or youth who were thinking of getting involved with ISIS or other radical groups. He's talked them out of it by pointing out that it's not really Islam. So that's an important talking point for him. And he also talks about how the ability of Muslims to integrate into American society more so than in Europe is why we don't have as big a problem with disaffected Muslims as they do in Europe, which I think is an important point. And there are even some Muslim youth at the end who corroborate that point. And then he also starts off by comparing this radical Muslim recruiting to gang recruiting at the beginning of the clip from ABC yesterday morning over here.
Same way that the gang recruit people. They go to a young person who feel isolated, and they tap on the shoulder and says, "We have your back."
It's isolation.
Yes, isolation.
He told us about one young man who ISIS was trying to recruit online. Magid got him to change his mind by convincing him ISIS was perverting Islam's true message. Are you confident he'll never join a group like that?
I'm confident because his conclusion that this is not what Islam teaches.
Like you look at the kid in Egypt who was the bodybuilder and wanted to be a fitness instructor, and instead he's cutting off heads with ISIS.
But if you compare America to Europe, you will see less young people join ISIS than young kids from Europe.
And that's because of integration.
Absolutely, because in America, American Muslim community, I think, are very connected to the larger community.
Like these young men, one a member of the Boy Scouts, another a mosque youth group leader, another leading the prayers.
We have very welcoming communities, teaching what the real Islam is.
When you have people that are from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of religions living next to one another, they have to find a way to start accepting one another.
For this.
And that point from the last Muslim youth there about how people have to get together and be able to, live together. That's one of the reasons I think this whole idea about Islam being the mother lode of bad ideas and being anti-theist in a aggressive way that insults people's religions, even though I'm not a religious believer and I think that faith is irrational, to actually insult people. I mean, it's like, if you want to get along with people, you don't say nasty things about their mothers, or you don't. I mean, there are certain things that, even though you have free speech to say it, you certainly have the ability under the First Amendment to say whatever you want about Islam, or just like that. That's kind of what came up in the whole Charlie Hebdo thing, that I believe strongly in their ability to have free speech, but there may have been some things they said that were insulting that I wouldn't say if I were trying to get along with people in my community, like those Muslim youth you saw there at the end. But I want to show, of course, the contrary position about why it's important not to insult Muslims by pointing out the Islamic nature of radical Islam. This is Bill Maher having a discussion with Rob Reiner, mostly, and the rest of the panel, but I think Rob Reiner is the only other panelist who I'm really showing in this clip, where Bill Maher starts off by trying to contradict President Obama's whole point, which I've said goes a little too far for diplomatic reasons and not saying things are Muslim that are Muslim. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you see that. And it also ends with this important, or this interesting point about what happened in Iraq, but and Saddam Hussein. But here it is, and I'll talk about it after you see it here.
Let's start off with the big summit President Obama had this week. He invited a lot of Muslim groups to the White House to say terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, to which they said, then why are we here? Why didn't you invite a bunch of Presbyterians? So there's also this article this week in The Atlantic that got a lot of play. It's called What ISIS Really Wants by a guy named Graham Wood. And I want to show the quotes, a few quotes from Obama and then a few quotes from this, because they're diametrically opposed. And then you tell me who's right. Obama, some of the things he said were, no religion is responsible for terrorism. People are responsible for violence and terrorism. That sounds a lot like the NRA slogan, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Guns don't kill people.
Okay.
People kill.
He also said the notion that the West is at war with Islam is an ugly lie, even though he's dropping bombs at them all the time. Now, here's from The Atlantic. This is from Graham Wood. He said, the reality is that the Islamic State is Islamic. Yes, it has attracted psychopaths, but the religion preached by its most ardent followers derives from coherent and even learned interpretations of Islam. So who's right about this?
You know, I think neither are right, and neither are really hitting the nail on the head here.
I wasn't expecting that, Rob.
Well,
look at that. You're triangulating.
No, I'm not triangulating. I'm trying to get at a truthfulness here, which is, if you look at the most violent Islamic groups, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, these are essentially Sunni-based. The Muslim world was divided 1,400 years ago between Shia and Sunni, and the Sunnis are exerting their will and their control right now. And they would not be where they are now, especially in Syria and Iraq, had we not removed Saddam Hussein, which kept that area together with an iron fist.
He looks better all the time.
Well, no, I'm not saying...
No, he does.
I'm not saying...
And Gaddafi, too.
Well, I'm not saying Saddam Hussein was a good guy.
He wasn't a good guy, but the world doesn't... You know, it's not about what's the best thing. I mean, it is about what's the best. There are sometimes no good answers. It's just the best one possible.
Yes, I agree.
So I think Bill Maher at the beginning of that clip was kind of missing the point as to why President Obama doesn't want to emphasize the Islamic nature of radical Islam. And I think I discussed that several times already. But at the end there, pointing out that the deposing of Saddam Hussein is basically why we have ISIS now and some of these other problems. I think there is a lot of legitimacy to that argument from Carl Reiner and Bill Maher both agreed on. Although I'm going to show this weird theory from Richard Engel on NBC's Meet the Press in just a couple minutes, but I want to show one other clip on, or a couple other clips on ISIS, or one more clip on the Countering Violent Extremism Summit before I get to the ISIS threat, and that's where you're going to see the clip I was talking about where Richard Engel has this other bizarre theory as to what created ISIS. But here's Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson over on CBS's Face the Nation, where Bob Schieffer asked him one question I didn't see on any of the other shows. Like I said, he was on all 5 shows, Jay Johnson, but this is the only person who really asked him something that does kind of seem problematic about why the director of the FBI, James Comey, was not at this summit. And you can see that Jay Johnson doesn't really have a good answer to that over in this clip.
I want to ask you about this terrorism summit that the president had last week. It turns out the director of the FBI was not invited. You just talked about how the FBI is working with you. How can you have a terrorism summit and not have the director of the FBI there?
Well, the FBI is definitely very, very active in our counterterrorism efforts. His boss, the chief law enforcement officer of the country, Eric Holder, was there.
But that's not like having the director of the FBI there. Shouldn't he have been there?
Well, the FBI, without a doubt...
I know you weren't in charge of the invitations, but shouldn't he have been there?
Well, the FBI, without a doubt, is a crucial part of our counterterrorism efforts, without a doubt.
But that doesn't really answer why the director of the FBI wasn't there. So I thought that was a good question, and that's the last clip I want to show on the summit on countering violent extremism. But it sort of goes to the transition over to the next topic about ISIS and the continuing fight against ISIS, Islamic State, ISIL they call it in the administration. And I want to transition by going over to another clip from Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation, where he asked not a very tough question of Republican Senator John McCain, where he brings up the fact that the director of the FBI wasn't at this summit. And then he also talks about this briefing that the Obama administration had this last week, where they gave out a lot of details about how they're going to try to retake the city of Mosul from ISIS. And this was, like I said, not a very tough question, more of a tee-up for John McCain to say nasty things about Obama's foreign policy, which... surprise, surprise, he actually does over in this clip.
You know, some of the president's critics say there's just kind of a disconnect, not just between the White House and the Pentagon or the White House and other agencies, but just kind of throughout the government. I mean, the idea that you would not invite the director of the FBI to a summit on terrorism, I mean, strikes me is sort of unusual. And then last week, there was this incident involving the Pentagon, and that is that there was a briefing given by the military on the offensive we have planned against ISIS. They went over the troop numbers. They talked about the timing. I know immediately after, you and Senator Lindsey Graham put out a statement and said, when did we start announcing things like this before they happen? Then, after you said that, then it turns out the White House says, well, nobody told us about this, basically. I guess my question is, what's going on here?
That's my question, too. And, you know, everybody knows that Mosul has to be retaken, and it has to happen first because it's the second largest city in Iraq for a whole variety of reasons. But we didn't, in shock and awe, describe how we were going to do this spokesperson described how, when, where, what forces, and that is obviously could put the lives of Americans as well as the people we are asking to fight in greater danger if we telegraph everything about our plans to ISIS. So I just don't get it. I don't think when we decided that we need to go to Europe and World War II that we were going to tell the Nazis exactly when, where, and how we were going to land. But it's just very unfortunate.
Do you have you heard back, I guess I would say, from the White House since you asked them what was going on? I know you and Senator Graham wrote that letter to them. Have you heard back from them?
No, we haven't, and I'm not holding my breath.
Well, I'm glad Senator John McCain isn't holding his breath, because I don't think he can hold his breath that long. But I guess it wasn't that much of a surprise to see Senator John McCain attacking President Obama's foreign policy, especially for people who watch my show on a regular basis. I've shown many clips from the Sunday morning news analysis programs where Senator John McCain has been one of the strongest critics of President Obama's foreign policy. But I was a little surprised to see reporter Richard Engel over on NBC's Meet the Press, I talked about this a few minutes ago, come up with this weird theory of the creation of ISIS. Not that it was a result of the George W. Bush administration's policy in Iraq getting rid of Saddam Hussein, but that it actually is a result of President Obama's policy in Libya, because it starts with a report on this beheading of Egyptian Coptic Christians in Libya this last week, and you'll see there's a still photo of these people in orange jumpsuits being marched by, I think, the edge of the ocean or some water shoreline, and I think this may be the clip that gets me unmonetized this week, because anything that has to do with like radical Muslims beheading people, I think that's like what mostly they find too sensitive on YouTube to monetize. But anyway, I had to show this clip of Richard Engel claiming that President Obama's Libya policy is what created ISIS, which I'll talk about a little more after you see it over here.
The hostages weren't famous, just Egyptian Christians who'd been looking for migrant work in Libya. They're famous now, butchered as part of the ISIS plan to enslave, convert, or exterminate opposing faiths.
And today, we're on the south of Rome, on the land of Islam, Libya, sending another message.
And something else was murdered 21 times on that terrible day on the beach, the hopes and dreams of the Arab Spring, and with them, the U.S. administration's Mideast policy. Some experts are now calling Libya the Somalia of the Mediterranean, a lawless land across from Europe's shores. Libya was the Obama administration's first war of choice.
What George W. Bush did to Iraq is the same thing that President Barack Obama did to Libya. That is, he took a state that was stable, that was an ally in the war on terror, and went in with a military intervention and destroyed the state.
Although there was no identifiable threat or benefit to the United States, the administration sent in the jets to defend Libyan rebels on moral grounds. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had repeatedly said he was about to flatten with no mercy the city of Benghazi, where a rebel uprising, live tweeted and full of hope, was brewing.
We have intervened to stop a massacre.
An administration that couldn't wait to get out of Iraq sent American troops into Libya and kept them overhead until Gaddafi was well and truly gone.
We came, we saw, he died.
Then the U.S. left Libya to the Mad Max militiamen who had taken it over.
The best rebels turned out to be radical Islamists.
And the war in Libya would have far broader implications than that. It raised expectations in the wider Arab world. In Syria, people took to the streets, confident that they too would get American help. The administration at first encouraged the Syrian rebels, but never sent them any meaningful assistance or heavy weapons. And like a wound in the body, the growing chaos in Syria spread, ISIS advanced, and brought down Iraq next door, which was barely on its feet after 10 years of war. It was there, in the Iraqi city of Mosul, that ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself the Caliph of the Islamic State, founding a terrorist state across Syria and Iraq, armed with American weapons his men took from the Iraqi army, which all but collapsed in fear. Now, the U.S. is being dragged back into war in the Middle East. It hopes to stand the Iraqi army back up and send to take back Mosul with the help of Kurdish fighters from northern Iraq. The U.S. military says some American ground troops may be needed to lead the charge. Taking Mosul will not be easy, especially since ISIS has had months to prepare for the battle. The real question is, what's the wider strategy for stability in Iraq and Syria and now Libya? Stability that would truly deny ISIS a home. This remains the hard question, and this administration has yet to offer a convincing answer.
Now, that was kind of strange at the end. I mean, I guess you can make an argument that the failure of President Obama's policy in Libya is responsible for the creation of ISIS because of that it promoted or it encouraged the uprisings in Syria, and then the Obama administration didn't come to their aid. I mean, that's like the kind of argument you could make in a paper or in an editorial, but it doesn't really seem like a fact that a reporter should report, at least to me. Although the analysis at the beginning of that clip about the failure of the Obama administration's policy in Libya, that I think was a little bit more factual, or at least maybe I agree with a little more. I'm not sure, because what Obama did in Libya didn't really work out that well, and although it may be a little bit going a little bit too far the way they compared it to calling it like Obama's Iraq, where he like deposed a leader and left a vacuum. I don't think it's quite that bad, because there was already a rebellion going on at the time, so that isn't quite analogous to what was going on in Iraq. And the next clip I want to show is another sort of view of what's going on with ISIS. This is another Republican, I think, a little more reasonable than what I showed from Senator John McCain. This is Governor John Kasich of Ohio, who sounds very much like he's running for president, and he has a good rap together as to why he thinks there's a better way to approach the threat from ISIS. And he talks about boots on the ground, but he uses kind of this weasel phrase that I think may gain favor with the Republicans. It's world boots on the ground, so it's not necessarily American boots on the ground, and that's important. I actually that's like the one kind of thing I agree with in the midst of all these criticisms that I disagree with, as I will discuss after you see Governor John Kasich, who had an extended interview with Gloria Borger on CNN State of the Union yesterday, over in this clip.
Would you handle ISIS differently from the way the president?
Well, I honestly, I think that the Western world needs to be united, and we need to invite our friends in the Arab world together. And we do need to develop a plan, and we're not going to solve this problem just by bombing.
Would you?
I think we should be part of an effort to deal with this problem before it gets much worse.
So you would consider boots on the ground?
Sure.
But Americans don't want boots on,
Look, Americans will go for leadership that makes sense. Our job, as public officials, is not to put our finger in the air. Our job is to listen and then lead.
So you would say to the American people...
Well, first of all, I'm not president now, so I'm not making a speech tonight in the Oval Office. I'm just suggesting to you that at some point in dealing with ISIS, you mark my words, whether John Kasich, you ever hear from him again, at some point it will require boots on the ground from the world to be able to deal with this problem. And I would rather deal with it sooner than later, but you just don't go running over there. You've got to have a battle plan. You've got to figure out exactly what you're going to do. But I would never suggest that we should engage in nation building or trying to convert all these people to our way of life. We need stability, and we need to stop this.
If you were...
So that seems like trying to draw the line of someone running for president, especially in the Republican primaries, where boots on the ground, but it's world boots on the ground and no nation building. And also he used that word stability. That's like no nation building, stability. That means we're going in there to put in some government. It doesn't have to be a democracy. It doesn't have to be our way of life. We don't have to expect that from people in the Arab or Muslim or African world, apparently. But anyway, that seemed to be at least a better set of talking points for a Republican primary than what you heard from John McCain, who's not running for president. But in terms of the world boots on the ground, that I said that was one part that I agreed with. It. I've said over several months or even several years that I think that the regional powers are the ones who really should provide the boots on the ground, and to the extent that there's a military solution to this problem. But I think there should also be some sort of regional conference to rewrite the borders that were drawn by the Western powers after World War I or during World War I in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, for anyone who's a history buff like I am. But I want to show a point that Bill Maher made about the way the regional powers should be dealing with this problem, where he talked about the number of troops ISIS has compared to the number of troops the surrounding powers, and a lot of these militaries have been funded by the United States supposedly to deal with regional threats. Although he starts off by talking about Republican former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, another person running for president, and how he said that ISIS had 200,000 fighters instead of 20,000, which no one really seemed to talk about, but Bill Maher did on his show last Friday over in this clip.
He kind of answered that already, because he gave a speech this week, and he said that ISIS fighters, I think the figure he had was 200,000?
Yeah, he was off by 180,000.
He's off by 180,000.
And then he corrected later, said he misspoke.
On Fox News, they were like, it's no big deal. Really? You're trying to be the leader of the free world, and you're off by a factor of 10?
Yeah.
And you're the smart Bush?
Yeah.
But you know what? Okay, so there's 20,000 ISIS fighters. Here's what I keep saying every week. Why can't the people in the region take care of this without us? I did a little research here.
It's an old question.
Let me tell you, let me give you the numbers of the armed forces of Jordan, 180,000. Turkey, 991,000. Egypt, 1.4 million. Iraq, 800,000. The Kurds have up to 250,000. The Saudis, 250,000. Lebanon, 280. Syria, 600. There's almost 5 million people without Iran who might want to kick some Sunni ass. Why can't they do it? Why can't they put some boots on the ground if they have 5 million against 20,000?
And that's a really good question. That's something I've talked about on my Sunday clip roundups going back almost a year now, with this whole ISIS problem as to why these so-called moderate Sunni powers like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, some of them are putting in their air power now, but if anyone's going to provide boots on the ground, it should be those powers. And then that creates a problem with Iran is the big Shia power and is supporting Assad in Syria, and that would be, there could be like a regional conflict. And I think I showed a clip a couple weeks back where the foreign minister of Jordan was saying the king of Jordan was claiming there might be a third world war out of this, and I guess that is why the boots on the ground part is not as important as the regional conference to take care of the problems in the Muslim and Arab world. And I've talked about that going back several years. Sort of, I think I called it a Congress of Vienna for the Middle East, but based more on like Wilsonian principles of self-determination. And anyway, I do want to show this a couple more clips on ISIS. First, this is Republican Senator Bob Corker talking about why it is that we don't negotiate with ISIS for hostages. I think Chuck Todd asked sort of a poignant question because there was an interview with the parents of one of the hostages. Her name is Kayla Mueller. Her father, I think, is Carl Mueller, if I have the names right. And Chuck Todd confronted this Republican Senator Bob Corker with the question from a grieving parent, why couldn't we negotiate for the life of our daughter, and got the standard answer that, ransom encourages more hostage taking over in this clip.
For many Americans, ISIS has been brought home by these brutal killings of American citizens that were held hostage. My colleague Savannah Guthrie just finished an interview with Kayla Mueller's parents, who are taking specific issue with U.S. policy on hostage. I want to play a clip of it for you and get your response on the other side. Okay.
We understand the policy about not paying ransom, but on the other hand, any parents out there would understand that you would want anything and everything done to bring your child home. And we tried and we asked, but they put policy in in front of American citizens' lives.
Senator Corker put policy in front of American citizen lives. Look, that is a grieving father. What do you say to him, or what do you say to other Americans?
Look, Chuck, I can't imagine a greater pain for a parent than knowing that your child is abducted and you're trying to do everything you can to cause them to be free and to be back home and to be with your family. At the same time, what you do when you begin to pay ransom, which is how these groups support themselves, what you do is encourage them to take even other American citizens, other people, and so you encourage them to continue to do what they're doing even more. So this has been a long-standing U.S. policy. It's a policy that I support. At the same time, I understand the extreme pain that a family would go through knowing that this is our U.S. policy and knowing that their daughter, their loved daughter, lost their life.
You know, so I guess that's kind of a tough question to ask someone who is in favor of this policy of not negotiating with terrorists, showing the clip there from the father of someone whose daughter was just killed by ISIS. But there was no follow-up there about either the trading of the so-called Guantanamo 5 for Bo Bergdahl with the Taliban. You know, I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, how the Obama administration said the Taliban was like an indigenous insurgent force and not terrorists, which there is a little bit of truth to that. Or, of course, Ronald Reagan, didn't he trade arms for hostages with the whole Iran-Contra thing? No one ever really brings that up in this context, I guess. But I want to show one more clip on ISIS before I move on to the next topic. This is our old friend Senator Lindsey Graham, who is also running for president, apparently. I'm not going to show the Jonathan Karl extended story on Lindsey Graham running for president, but I am going to show him giving an answer on ISIS where it sounds pretty much like he is running for president. He talks about how the people of Iowa know that it's radical Islam since, you know, Iowa has the first caucus. And then there's something really weird near the end of this clip where he talks about how ISIS wants to eradicate, he wants to convert all the, you know, to purify Islam and to kill all the Jews, the Christians. And I'm pretty sure, I've listened to this a few times, and I'm pretty sure in addition to Jews and Christians, he's claiming that ISIS wants to get rid of vegetarians. I'm not sure where that came from, but I'll talk about that a little more after you see this last clip on the ISIS threat over here.
When it comes to foreign policy, I've been more right than wrong the last 3 years, and I've never been more worried about my country than I am today in terms of radical Islam. And yes, it is radical Islam. People in Iowa understood radical Islam is the source of the problem here. They've adopted a theory of religion that's 1,000 years old, that requires a worldwide caliphate, that will purify the Islamic religion, kill or convert every Christian and Jew and vegetarian in their way, and they're not going to stop unless somebody stops them, and we need to get this right.
So yeah, it was there. That's like the fourth time I've listened to it, and I'm pretty sure that Lindsey Graham claimed that ISIS is going to eradicate vegetarians, but I didn't even realize that. I mean, I don't know everything about Islam or radical Islam, but you can let me know down in the comments section if you know anything about ISIS wanting to eradicate vegetarians. That's a new one, or maybe that's some sort of rhetorical flourish, because we all know how Senator Lindsey Graham enjoys the rhetorical flourishes. But that's the last clip I want to show on ISIS, but the next clip I want to show is also Senator Lindsey Graham on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. This is part of the several clips I want to show on the split in the Republican Party, mostly on the split on funding of the Department of Homeland Security. You know, the Senate, including Senator Lindsey Graham, is pretty much ready to give President Obama full funding of the Department of Homeland Security because it's a political loser for them to shut down the Department of Homeland Security when they've been hyping this threat from ISIS and from radical Islam for the last several months since the attack in Paris. And there have been some other, lone wolf attacks. So this is not a good time to defund Homeland Security. But apparently people in the House, these Tea Party people in the House, are all upset about the immigration executive action, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. But here's Senator Lindsey Graham trying to flip around the whole Department of Homeland Security funding issue, saying, he hopes the House will do the right thing, but this shows how, again, President Obama's foreign policy has failed. And if you want to see how he flips it around to that issue, it's over in this clip.
I will not be part of that.
Okay, you won't be, but can you get it through the House?
Time will tell. I hope my House colleagues will understand that our best bet is to challenge this in court, that if we don't fund the Department of Homeland Security, we'll get blamed as a party. And to anyone who is watching the world as it is, I've never seen more terrorist organizations with more safe haven, with more money, with more capability to strike the homeland than I do today, and that's a direct result of a failed foreign policy by President Obama. And the worst thing to do is add gasoline to the fire by having the Republican Party defund the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, yeah, I guess Senator Lindsey Graham is right. It is too bad that we can't defund the Department of Homeland Security because the world's so scary because of President Obama's failed foreign policy. Those were the steps you have to go through to get through that Lindsey Graham argument, which, I guess it's another great piece of rhetoric by a Republican presidential candidate who probably has no chance, but I guess you never know with such a wide open field. Speaking of the way Republicans talk about things, over on Fox News Sunday, they brought up this issue with Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson. John Roberts, the guest host, gave it the Republican spin. He didn't ask about Republicans holding up funding for Department of Homeland Security. He focused on the Democrats in the Senate who are filibustering the Republican bill that would strip away funding for Obama's executive action on immigration while funding the rest of Homeland Security. So it's really the Democrats' fault, at least according to the question that John Roberts asked and then insisted on being true over in this clip.
This is tied to your budget, which runs out on February the 27th. Why are Democrats blocking debate in the Senate on the Senate bill?
Well, Democrats are not blocking debate.
They are.
What is happening is that some in Congress
they're filibustering to block debate.
Hold on. What is happening is that some in Congress want to tie defunding our executive actions to my entire Homeland Security budget.
Yeah, understood. But why can't Democrats just introduce an amendment to strip that part from the bill and undertake at least debate in the Senate as opposed to stonewalling?
We should have the debate about immigration reform, but you should not tie that to the funding for the third largest department of our government, 240,000 people, which includes, by the way, efforts to do all the things we've been talking about on the counterterrorism front, the Coast Guard, FEMA, in the midst of a very harsh winter. That funding for FEMA, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, our Border Patrol agents, our customs agents, our cybersecurity efforts, all runs out at the end of this week. And so what I've been continually saying to Congress, to the public, and to the press is that we need a fully funded Department of Homeland Security. We need a clean appropriations bill for our department.
And I think a lot of people understand the importance of that. But is the president partly at fault here because it was his executive action? Rather than letting Congress handle this, he went ahead and he passed this executive action. Why not pull that off the table and let Congress handle the immigration part?
The president has said repeatedly, including on the day we announced our executive actions, that he would like to have the immigration debate with Congress. Unfortunately, that has not happened. We have waited for years, literally, for Congress to get to the business of immigration reform. The Senate passed a good bill, the House has not. Now what is going on in Congress is there are some who want to defund our executive actions and do it in a way that holds up the entire budget of Homeland Security for this nation. That is unacceptable from a public safety, Homeland Security view, and I'm talking to my friends on the Hill, Democrat and Republican, about the importance of let's get on with funding the Department of Homeland Security.
So even with that Fox News spin on the questioning, I think that Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson showed there why this is going to be a political loser for the Republicans. The talking points are just too strong. He mentioned all the threats. One of the weird threats he mentioned in there was winter, although I guess that's something that people can see right outside their doors in a lot of the United States right now. So I guess Homeland Security has FEMA under it, which helps people when they're really bad storms. Although he mentioned it again in his answer over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos when he was talking to George Stephanopoulos when he was saying all the bad things that are going to happen if the Department of Homeland Security shuts down because of some sort of Republican fight over immigration. And I'm going to get to the immigration issue in a minute. But in this one, it almost sounded like, I thought for a minute it might be a Game of Thrones reference, that he actually said winter is coming, but he didn't actually say winter is coming. But it almost had that vibe to it, I think. But you can let me know what you think after you see that clip over here, too, by the way.
You mentioned the issue of funding. Your department runs out of funding this Friday. Any closer to getting that resolved? And what happens if it's not?
Well, it's imperative that we get it resolved, because if we don't, by Friday at midnight, Homeland Security, the Homeland Security budget for this nation basically evaporates. And I've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. They were gone last week, but they're back this week. But I've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking to Democrats, Republicans, about how critical it is in these challenging times, in particular with the global terrorist threat, with the cybersecurity threat, and with the harsh winter we're facing right now, that we have a budget for Homeland Security. And I'm a little frustrated, frankly, because when I talk to my friends on the Senate side, they say, go talk to the House. And when I go talk to my friends on the House side, they say, it's not me, I passed my bill, go talk to the Senate. So they're literally doing this. My hope is that in the 4 working days they have this week, they'll finally come together and do the right thing and pass an appropriations bill free and clear of any efforts to defund our executive actions.
Okay.
So yeah, the harsh winter. I guess he didn't say winter is coming, but maybe I'm just looking forward to Game of Thrones returning. I think it's in April. But I also want to show another clip on this issue of the split in the Republican Party and the Department of Homeland Security funding. This is what Senator John McCain had to say about the issue, and I think he may provide the I think he even used the term off-ramp on this issue that Republicans may take, which is the district court judge who ruled, at least temporarily, that President Obama's executive action on immigration was not going to go into effect. And that's not going to last very long, I don't think, but it could last long enough to let Republicans use it as an excuse to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security. And that's a point that Senator John McCain made. And also he expressed his anger about what Obama did on immigration, even though what he did is totally lawful, as I'll get to when I show a couple clips on that specific issue. But here's John McCain talking about it over on CBS's Face the Nation over here.
Senator, let me just ask you about this deal. Do you think the Senate would possibly shut down, cut off funds to the Department of Homeland Security with the country facing what it's facing right now?
I don't believe we will. We now have an exit sign, and that is the federal court decision saying that the president's actions unilaterally are unconstitutional. And I think we've got a great argument to the United States Supreme Court where it will go, because 22 times the President of the United States said it was unconstitutional for him to take the action that he had decided to take. So I believe we've got an option there that we should pursue. I'd love to be a friend of whoever is taking this case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. So I think that's the best way that we can resolve this. But have no doubt, I am angry, as are my constituents in a border state, that the President of the United States would unconstitutionally issue the executive orders that he did.
Of course, this federal judge in Texas didn't even reach the constitutional issue. It wasn't a question of constitutionality. It had to do with the administrative, I can't remember what is that thing called, with the way administrative rules are supposed to be promulgated. It had to do with legislation. It was statutory interpretation, had nothing to do with the Constitution. But I'll get to that a little more when I have a couple clips specifically on the immigration ruling. But I want to show one more clip on the split in the Republican Party that's not about funding of the Department of Homeland Security. This is Governor John Kasich from Ohio sort of taking a shot at Senator Rand Paul. And this is on the issue of whether Ohio Governor John Kasich is conservative enough because he, you know, did things like expand Medicaid or expand eligibility for Obamacare and expand Medicaid and do things that basically help poor people. And you'll see he first takes a dig at Senator Rand Paul as not being able to tell him from his father, Representative Ron Paul, which I don't know what that's all about, but and then he goes on to quote the Bible and how he's like a compassionate Christian while still a conservative over in this clip.
Talking about Ohio, you did win with 64% of the vote. Impressive statistics. 60% of women voted for you. 26% of African Americans voted for you. You look like presidential gold on paper. Yet if you look at the conservatives who vote in Republican primaries, you also took the Medicaid expansion money. And the Tea Party thinks you've gone to the dark side, that you're for big government. Rand Paul has said that governors who did that think that, quote, money grows on trees.
You mean Senator Ron Paul?
No, Rand Paul.
Oh, I get them confused sometimes. Ron and Rand, and I served with Ron. But anyway, I think what works for us in Ohio, we are running surpluses of $2 billion. We are structurally balanced. Half the states, almost half the states, are not.
But what do you say to
Let me go on.
conservatives?
I've cut the taxes in Ohio, the legislature and I, by the largest tax cut in our history. That's kind of conservatism. Now, let me tell you another thing. You know, Matthew 25 says that it's about how you treat the widowed, how you treat the poor, how you treat the hungry, how you clothe those who have no clothes. That is a conservative position to help them get on their feet so they then can assume their rightful place in our society. The faith community, at least I think still is, at least used to be, a part of the conservative movement. And the conservative movement is you don't just kick people to the shadows or push them out the side of the road.
So what would you say to Rand Paul when he says governors like you?
I'm not sure I would say much to him. I mean, I don't know what he's, you know, I don't know, maybe it doesn't work in Kentucky. Maybe everybody's fine. Maybe there aren't people who are suffering these problems. It's either pay me now or pay me later. And we think by giving people an opportunity to get the help they need and then give them the tools they need to rise, that is conservatism. And you know what? I've got as much a right as anybody in the Republican Party to define what conservatism means. We've cut taxes more than anybody in the country, and they're wondering about my conservatism. Maybe I should wonder about theirs.
So once again, Governor John Kasich of Ohio sounds very much like someone running for president, especially with the digs he took against Senator Rand Paul, who is also very likely running for president. And that's the last clip I want to show on the Republican Party split, but I said I would show a couple quick clips on the immigration issue. A Texas district court judge who was pretty much picked by the plaintiffs, by the Republicans who were suing President Obama over the executive action. They got to choose where they were going to sue, so they got to choose this judge who has a history of being against President Obama's immigration actions. And so there's actually quite a likelihood that this will be overturned by the Fifth Circuit. But over on Fox News Sunday, John Roberts seemed to think the opposite and posed the question to Secretary of Homeland Security and Jay Johnson. You know, Homeland Security oversees the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Is it a bureau department? I should know that, but I can't remember what the type of, what level of a government organization is. I think it's because the Homeland Security is a department, so it's got to be like a bureau, Immigration Customs Enforcement. I'm not sure, but anyway, here's how Jay Johnson responded to John Roberts' claim that the Fifth Circuit was going to back up what this district court judge did on immigration in Texas this last week over in this clip.
And immigration. The Justice Department said that it's going to appeal U.S. District Judge in Texas's Andrew Hanen's ruling on the immigration executive action. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals should uphold Judge Hanen's ruling because in cases like this, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals or any court of appeals tends to preserve the status quo. and the status quo was not having this immigration executive action in place. What do you say?
We will appeal. This is what appellate courts are for. We will seek a stay of Judge Hayden's injunction. Looking at it from my common sense perspective, the judge in his opinion, and I read all 123 pages of it, said he has no quarrel with the notion that we are allowed to prioritize how we use our resources to deport people in this country. And we are prioritizing. We're prioritizing on convicted criminals. We are prioritizing on building border security, deporting those who are recent arrivals who are apprehended at the border. But there's a large segment of the undocumented population in this country who've been here for years, who are not going to be deported in any administration, Democratic or Republican. That's the reality.
But why not
and
let
so,
Congress
hold
handle
on. So from my Homeland Security law enforcement perspective, it is better to find ways to encourage that group of people to come forward, come out of the shadows, get on the books, be accountable, receive a work authorization, and pay taxes. And what the judge's opinion does is it says you can prioritize, and I don't quarrel with your leaving these people alone because they're not priorities, they're not criminals, and they've been here for years, but effectively I can't bring them out of the shadows. They have to stay in the shadows. And from the law enforcement perspective, from the perspective of the sheriff, the chief, the commissioner in cities and counties around the country, that's not a good thing. And so we are going to appeal, and we're going to seek a stay of this. And we welcome the debate in Congress about immigration reform. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to have it.
So yeah, I don't think this is going to turn out well for the Republicans because, like I said, this wasn't even a constitutional issue. It had to do with administrative statutes. And the thing is, what's silly about the Republican argument, about it being a constitutional issue, is that it says in the statute passed by Congress on immigration that the that the Director of Homeland Security is supposed to prioritize who to deport, that they're supposed to come up with these regulations. It gives all this discretion to the executive branch to, it doesn't say everyone has to be deported, and it says they're supposed to prioritize. It gives them authority to give out work permits. Basically, everything that the Obama administration is doing has been authorized by Congress, and if they don't like it, all they have to do is pass a law, their own comprehensive immigration reform that they're not doing, like Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson said at the end of that last clip. And one additional clip I want to show on this is one more example of this ridiculous Republican argument. This is from the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, who used to be the Attorney General. So he's a lawyer and should know about what is in the Constitution and what is statutory, but he makes this argument that only Congress can do this, even though, like I said, Congress has passed laws specifically giving the authority to the executive branch. And then he also talks up, border enforcement, which is a big Republican talking point that doesn't really answer the problem of what to do with undocumented people who've been living here and are part of our communities. But here's that clip from CBS's Face the Nation talking to Bob Schieffer, who in his follow-up doesn't really bring up the congressional authorization. That's the kind of detail that rarely makes these shows over in this country.
What to do with those who are here by the Constitution itself is dedicated to the United States Congress, not the President, to decide how to deal with it. And so we need Congress to have the latitude to fulfill its responsibility to solve the problem.
Well, Congress can't seem to get together and decide what to do. They just remain at loggerheads. In the meantime, you in Texas, you've got 800,000 people there. What are you doing now?
What I am doing now as governor for the state of Texas, I have outlined a plan that does what Americans really want to have achieved. And that is, I have a plan that will secure the border. I'm going to add more than 500 more Department of Public Safety officers, more Texas Rangers, more technology. We are coming out of our own pocket, Texas taxpayers' pockets, to secure the border, doing the job that the federal government must do. The first step that has to be taken in this whole process is to secure the border.
So, like I said, that's a pretty nonsensical argument from Governor of Texas Greg Abbott about Congress having the authority, not the executive branch, because Congress has given the executive branch that authority through legislation. And Bob Schieffer in his follow-up, he used this more conventional wisdom talking point about how Congress hasn't done anything, which is also true. Congress hasn't passed comprehensive immigration reform, so that is a legitimate follow-up, I guess, but it's not as important as the point that the corporate media never seems to bring up, or maybe it's just because I'm a lawyer, but I think is the much more dispositive point that Congress has passed legislation that's given the executive branch the authority, which I think I've said like 5 times now. And before I finish the show, I want to show another clip of Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation, this time talking to Senator John McCain, where I think he also did not ask a very confrontational question. This is on Ukraine, where he kind of tees up John McCain to discuss why he, again, hates President Obama's foreign policy, this time on the issue of Ukraine, which is kind of dropped off the radar of the Sunday morning shows over this last weekend. But there was some movement where, the Europeans have, there's been a ceasefire, and the Europeans are supposedly threatening Putin to impose sanctions if he doesn't obey the ceasefire. And I don't have like a long news reporting clip on that, but I'll show how Bob Schieffer over on CBS's Face the Nation teed up Senator John McCain to attack the Obama administration on this, and even emphasize the point where Senator John McCain said he's ashamed of his country over in this clip.
About Ukraine, it sounds like things are getting even worse there. How do you read what's happening there, and what do we need to do now?
I believe that the German Chancellor and the President of France legitimized for the first time in 70 years the dismemberment of a country in Europe. It's shameful. Vladimir Putin has not paid any price. Even the ceasefire was violated until he achieved his objective of that vital rail link. He'll pull back some now, and the next will be Mariupol, so that he can establish a land bridge to Crimea. And honestly, it's terrible. The Ukrainians aren't asking for American boots on the ground. That's not the question here. They're asking for weapons to defend themselves, and they are being slaughtered, and their military is being shattered. This is a shameful chapter. I'm ashamed of my country, I'm ashamed of my president, and I'm ashamed of myself that I haven't done more to help these people. It is really, really heartbreaking.
What do you think can be done now?
Oh, we can give them, to start with, we should give them weapons with which to defend themselves. There are Russian tanks in eastern Ukraine, Bob, that they have no weapon to fight against. They have, some of the best Russian special forces are there, and they will continue this aggression for as long as they can get away with it. And it's not just the military side, but economically, they're on the verge of collapse as well. Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine not to be part of Europe, and he is succeeding in doing so. He's putting enormous pressure on the Baltics, not to mention Moldova, and continued occupation of Georgia as well. This is really a dark chapter in the history of our alliance.
Well, I'll say this, Senator. I've known you for a long, long time, interviewed you many, many times. I've never heard you say, I'm ashamed of my country, which you just said.
And I'm ashamed of myself.
I guess everybody's ashamed, or I don't know. That was kind of a weird note. But I guess I'm going to end the show on that weird note, although I have to comment on that briefly to say that I agree with the general idea of supporting the Ukraine against Russian aggression, and that's definitely happening in various ways in the eastern Ukraine, although I've seen this other spin on it where people say that it's U.S. support of anti-Russians in Ukraine created paranoia on the part of Putin, where he felt surrounded, and I don't know, I don't completely or even mostly buy that, although I suppose it's important to see how that might be the viewpoint from the inside, from Russia, and also as to why Putin has gained a lot of popularity in this whole conflict. But I just don't think there's a military solution to that conflict, so the military aid isn't really that important. The economic aid and coming to some coalition with Europe as to how to fight Russian aggression. That, I think, does make sense. But the rest of it and being ashamed of our country, I don't know where he gets that. But that's the last clip I want to show. Like I said, I appreciate, even at this strange time for the show, I had over 80 of you show up to watch it live. I've been reading your comments along the way. For example, I saw this comment from the Norwegian 76. I hope LV runs out of time to read the comments today. Well, yeah, it has been kind of weird down there, and I'm not going to show any more of the comments, but I did read them along the way, and I actually saved them all. I'm trying to find a way to keep them, because, you know, they all disappear when this becomes a recorded video. All the live comments disappear. So, but I saved them, and I may start posting them over on my Patreon. With, you know, and you don't have to. It'll just be something I do publicly, so you don't even have to pledge to be a donor on Patreon. But if you want to be able, if you want me to keep being able to make some reasonable, like, hourly wage from the 10+ hours I put into picking out all the clips and organizing them and putting together this show every Sunday, or in this case Sunday night and Monday morning, you can either donate to me over at patreon.com/liberalviewer. You can pledge monthly there, or over on my YouTube channel page at youtube.com/liberalviewer. You can give one-time donations if you happen to be in the United States, Mexico, Japan, or Australia. So I appreciate that support, so I can keep doing the show even if it doesn't end up being monetized. And I'll be back next Sunday at the regular time, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. It should at least be a couple months before I have to delay the show again. I think in the middle of April I may have to, but otherwise look for it 6:30 p.m. Pacific time every Sunday, picking out the best clips from Sunday morning news analysis shows and a little bit of political comedy along the way, if there's any available that I can find. And I guess until next Sunday, or until I put out another one of my edited, produced videos, I'll just be seeing you all around the internet.